Hello again. So we are now doing chapter 1. And if you want to follow along either on the PowerPoint, you can certainly download that or just open it and follow along as you go. But I also have it up. And you can also open up your text and actually look at the chapter as we go too. This might actually be a good way to kind of follow along, but with more additional detail. And what I will try to do, I'm not going to go through and really dig into each chapter so that it's a waste that you have read it, but I'm going to try to make sense of what all of the chapter covers and cover some of the sticky points and certainly emphasize a few things that I think are most important for you to remember. And so I'm going to first go ahead and do the slideshow. I think that will look better. So the slideshow too, PowerPoint doesn't necessarily cover all of the material, so it's extremely important that you read the chapter and then watch the video. It will make much more sense to you because I'm kind of going to glide through a few things, and I will assume too that you have read a few things. So this is a way for you to make sure that you have, I guess, that you understand what's going on. And now much of what we talk about in chapter 1 is going to deal with what we call prehistorical civilization. All that means history, the word hist, or that term hist, comes from the Greek story. And essentially what it means is it's before we wrote down our stories. So it's before written language. Any culture that does not have a written language, which includes actually a lot of Native American tribes, because it doesn't have a written language, it is technically still prehistoric because it doesn't have that written language. So we're going to deal with prehistoric cultures and then even talk about the beginnings of history, the beginnings of written text. When we get to the Greeks in chapter 2, we'll have a lot of text, but right now we just have some. And even in the Egyptian culture, which will be the last big culture we will cover in this chapter, they had hieroglyphics and they used pictograms, but they did not have the same. We don't have the evidence of their language the way that we do have of the Greeks and Roman, different linguistic options and what they printed out and copied over, because everything that we have from the Egyptians pretty much has been what was painted on or carved into stone, and that's mostly in burial areas. So a lot of what they did do has been lost to time. We know they used papyrus, the Egyptians did, but the papyrus does not last. It's not as durable as paper and vellum and parchment and things like that. So we have a lot that's been gone, that's just been destroyed over time, so we don't have it. The other thing that's interesting about these Stone Ages is that because they're prehistoric, we don't have a whole lot to go on. So as here, of course, today in our world, so many things are written down and videotaped and recorded. Everybody's recording their, even what they're eating for dinner on Facebook and Instagram. And at that time, there was nothing like that. So what we have for the most part in evidence of how the people lived and what they ate and things like that are from a handful, a very small group of burials that we know are set within these time periods. And because of where they lived, we kind of know where they moved to and how they lived in that way. But there's much that we don't know. Much of this is still rather speculative because we have so little evidence and we have no written evidence. All we have is evidence from burials and artifacts and old pottery and things like stone tools. Now, the reason it's called the Stone Ages is not because they made everything out of stone. It's just they made their tools out of stone. So they didn't make cars like the Flintstones and run them along, and they didn't have record players or anything that they were, dinosaurs were running. No, there was nothing like that. But what they did have is they had stone tools. And so this was before metallurgy. Once they started using metals and being able to use heat to melt the metals and put them together and make, joined metal types and like bronze and things like that. Once they could do that, then we became a different kind of age. So the next age would be the Bronze Age, and that's tin mixed with copper. And then the next would be the Iron Age. And so the tools, the weaponry, the utensils, all of those things would be made out of a different substance. That's what would create these different ages. So the Stone Ages, though, and this is, it says 35,000 to 10,000 BCE. That's another thing. Before the Common Era is what BCE means. And it's just like BC, but in later, after we get to that Common Era part, we at least most paleontologists and most anthropologists use CE instead of AD, which means Anno Domini in Latin. They use CE. So it just means of the Common Era. Now that was dictated primarily by Christianity, the advent of Christianity. So we will talk about that though in a little bit in chapter 3 and then in chapter 4. For these guys though, what really happened from the Paleolithic, that's the Old Stone Era, through the Mesolithic or the Middle Stone Era, and then into the Neolithic or New Stone Era, which of course spanned thousands of years, is that in the Paleolithic era, the populations were very small, tiny tribal communities, and they were highly nomadic because they would follow herds of animals so that they could eat fresh meat, and they would follow the seasons. They would go north in the summer and south in the winter so that they could get the crops that were growing at the prime types of places, because they did not know how to do their own planting of crops. They knew nothing of animal husbandry, at least from the evidence. It suggests that they did not. They lived in caves. Many of them had very rudimentary places, for shelter. And even in the Mesolithic, there was some shelter, but much of it was still rather temporary. But as we shift into Neolithic or the New Stone Era, which was 8,000 to 2000 BCE, and we're going to talk about the Egyptians around 2000 BCE, and that's about 4,000 years ago. And we're going to talk too about the Greeks once we get later. That just started a little bit later than that. And so in the Neolithic or New Stone Era, this was again pre-history. So we didn't have a written language. And yet what they were developing by this point is communities. And the communities were based usually alongside of waterways. So the Nile, in Mesopotamia, it's between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. But along these waterways, they had enough water to grow crops, and that by then they had learned, and this is really where the big difference is, they had learned, hey, we can actually tame these, and corral these sheep and goats and other animals, and we don't have to wander after them anymore. We can put them in little fences, and we can even get them to have babies so that we keep a crop of animals growing up so that we can keep eating. And then we can also grow our own crops. We just use the seasons instead of wandering northward and southward. We plant crops at the right time, and then we store what we get, the grain and the beans and things like that. And so we don't have to move anymore. So that's probably the biggest thing, is rather than being constantly moving tribes, they settle and make actual permanent towns and cities along the waterways. And then these different populations, which may not have encountered each other much, will end up beginning trade, along the waterway. They'll use different modes of transportation along the waterways, and they'll trade with each other that way. That will eventually create not only a monetary system so that they can trade and count how many things they're trading for what, or how much they're paying for something, but it will also create an alphabetical system. And this will be how they will communicate with each other. So essentially, even today, we have languages of trade. One of the most popular languages of trade in the world is English. And that's good for us because so many of us don't know any other languages. French is another one. Chinese is another one. But the truth is, a lot of people who do foreign trade, who do international trade, have people who know many different languages so that they can trade with lots of different people. What eventually happens though with this is that first we get pictograms where we have pictures to denote different things. And then later on, we will actually have alphabetical languages. In Greek and in Rome, the Roman Empire, it will be Latin. So there will be quite a transfer over several thousand years on what we can and can't do and where we live and how we live. So even among Native Americans here in both North and South America, stone tools are still pretty common. They were very common even around the beginning of the 18th century, so right around 1700. And they really did not, honestly, a lot of the Native American tribes here in the United States and in Canada, Mexico, and in South America have acquired, modern culture, but at the expense of often their written language, their oral language, their traditions, and many other cultural elements. And unfortunately, that happens as well. We have cultures that disappear. We have cultures that flourish and dominate other cultures. And that's kind of what we're going to cover a little bit too. So each time a new tribe would get some new technology that they could use in war against other tribes, then they would take power. And so there was a lot of, and still is, a lot of jockeying around for territory, for power, for resources, and things like that. At this time, though, the of course, these people they had stone tools, which we found in burial plots. They had no written language. And mainly, much of what they did was around surviving. They needed to, and primarily they needed to eat to survive. And then secondarily, they needed, well, and drink. And then they needed shelter so that they would survive the elements, especially in colder climates. And that's one reason why a lot of places were very nomadic. They wandered all over. But it's also a reason why a lot of the earliest civilizations are in warmer climates. So a lot of the Native American tribes were kept to to warmer climates. So there are a lot more native tribes, and there were a lot more populated in Central America, and then in lower North America and upper South America. And so the same thing, Egypt is not a cold place, and that's probably why populations were able to settle there. And that's most of the evidence we have now is, of course, from burial plots, and then what survived it's just so little of it, honestly, has survived, because if it wasn't made of stone, it was just eventually going to deteriorate. Now, they weren't stupid, these people. They were even artistic, and they certainly were about surviving. And they were probably far better capable of surviving than most of us are today. When we go and buy our groceries in a grocery store, and we don't plant our own crops, we don't slaughter our own animals, there's so much we don't know how to do in our basic survival. Most of us wouldn't do really well without air conditioning. And so that's something to consider as well. Now, we do have from very early on, we have a lot of examples of stone painting. There's quite a bit said about Lascaux, and honestly, there are reasons why these are really kind of cataloged in here. First of all, we don't know necessarily what they were all for. And you might even say, well, why would they paint all these inside of these caves? We don't know. That's the answer, is we don't know. We don't know why. But could it be, some ritual associated with hunting? Yes. Could it be a natural awareness of how they are part of the life cycle? Yes. Could it be they just wanted to decorate it with something really pretty and they thought animals were really pretty? It could be that. We just don't know. We do know, though, that the paintings were pretty realistic, far more than we would have probably expected for them to be, thousands and thousands and thousands of years old. The only real problem we have is that we have all of these paintings because the caves have been sealed for so long. And once they were open, a lot of the natural paints began to decay and fade. So Lascaux, for instance, actually, France invested quite a bit of money. I'm sure they had other donors as well. And they created essentially a walk-through museum where you could feel as if you were walking through the entire caves. It looks just like it. and yet you're actually walking through a replica of the caves because they wanted to preserve the caves. Because if thousands and thousands of people went through and walked through the caves, eventually all of the ink would be gone and it would have all deteriorated and there would be nothing left to look at. And so to preserve it, they chose to create a replica. And it's really quite, the outside of the building is weird looking, but it's really quite beautiful on the inside. And you do kind of, you forget that it's not real when you're going through that. So, but again, we still don't know what it was for. We also know that we do have some surviving Stone Age sculpture, not a lot. And most of the figures that survive are very small. We're going to see some bigger ones when we get to the Egyptians. Probably the most important figure that pops up all over the world, actually, is the Earth Mother figure or Mother Earth figure. Some people, they use it, the name the Venus of Willendorf for a while in the chapter, but she is one of many different representations. All of them look very similar though. And that's what's so strange, is even if they're on a different continent, the figure looks very similar. And there are some reasons why we think, and again, we don't know, but there's a reason why we think she looks the way that she looks. She's very squishy, and I've joked about that with my past classes too. But she's very voluptuous. She's very, she looks like she could even be pregnant. And that's, we think, this is what scholars think, is that she's, and she's often faceless. You can see that her hair on this slide is covering her face up. So it's not that she's not supposed to be super beautiful. Instead, she represents bounty. She represents the animals having babies that are healthy and grow into, adult animals. She represents people having lots of healthy babies. She represents crops being abundant. And the assumption is that, they kept the figures that, to pray to her and essentially give her offerings and help, ask for her help. And if she had favor towards them, then their crops would grow well and their animals would breed well and they'd have healthy babies. And if she didn't like you, then there'd be a drought, or all the crops would get drowned, or something horrible would happen, or there'd be a freeze and everybody would, essentially their life, the life of the tribe was dependent upon these levels of abundance. And so worship of her probably dominated because it was so important that these things grow. Once we have the influx of more patriarchal systems, the polytheistic god systems like in Greek mythology, Roman mythology, and Egyptian mythology, actually, and Norse, there are a lot of different earlier mythologies too, ancient systems. The woman does no longer have that kind of central role. Many of these systems are far more patriarchal, and so the women have a much more diminished role. And we think that's kind of why she disappeared. Even the Greek Demeter, and she is the goddess of the harvest. She is not necessarily seen to be that voluptuous. That's not how she's portrayed. And so it definitely, something had shifted from the Stone Age until we get to the more patriarchal polytheistic systems. And I'll probably go ahead and since it's hard to write in here, I'll probably go ahead and type in some possibilities, just things to remember, and especially words that I've used. But if there are any terms as we go through that you don't understand, please let me know and just ask questions, and I'll try to add to that. But a lot of these terms too will be in the chapter. So now we get to the Bronze Age, and this is where we talk about ancient Mesopotamia. And I think, I did not, yeah, the chapter actually has a map where you can kind of see the map of the world, where all the rivers are. And Mesopotamia actually means between two rivers. Like between, it's like the land between two rivers is what the word Mesopotamia means. And it's between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. But it was also created a really amazing trade of goods along these rivers. And that actually helped people share languages, certainly helped them develop a monetary system. We think that it pretty much developed here. in like Sumer, which is a part of Mesopotamia, and because of the trade, they developed the writings, and they also developed a system of cuneiforms or little pictograms, and they use the cuneiforms both as representations of themselves. So instead of signing your name, you would just take you have a little clay stamp, and you just stamp it into wet clay, and that would be like your signature. And so there was much more of that kind of stuff. They were also primarily polytheistic. And these polytheistic groups often had whole other sections of gods. So each community had its own system of gods, but they were very egalitarian about it. So they didn't really look at the other groups and go, well, your gods aren't real. No, they were just like, oh, you have gods too? Okay, cool. What are their names? And so there was a sharing of ideas, even if it was orally, because they didn't have written language yet. And those ideas often meant that many of these different cultures all had shared stories. So the flood myth that is so common, with Noah and his sons in the Judaic text, in the old, what we call the Old Testament, is actually very similar to a Greek story of flooding. From it actually had two. It wasn't Noah; his name was Pyrrha, and he was married to Deucalion. And they actually, no, Pyrrha was the girl, Deucalion was the guy. And they were just a couple that Zeus decided they were the only good people, and everybody else needed to be wiped off the earth because they were all vile. And so he created a flood. And this flood myth is very common. It's common in Hindu traditions. It's common in a lot of the ancient religions. And they think they all probably came from one single source, and they just kind of got carried from culture to culture. But certainly this was the beginning of real civilization, and it's certainly the beginning of writing. So Sumer was essentially, in Sumer, what was written there was Sanskrit. So that's the language that they used. And it really wasn't translatable. I mean, people had trouble with translation until the 20th century, but eventually they did figure it all out. And the first epic poem, that's a long narrative poem, was written in Sanskrit. And more than likely it was memorized by bards and sung or chanted orally for centuries before it was ever actually written down. But in Sumer, in around anyway 4000 BCE, it was written down in Sanskrit. Sumerians also invented the wheel at about 3500 BCE, and we're going to count down as we move forward in time because we're getting closer to that 0 point. That's how BCE works. And this is actually a one section of the Sumerian clay tablet that had part of Gilgamesh in it. And the Epic of Gilgamesh is really fascinating because he's next. But Gilgamesh was this kind of like greater than human guy who was super handsome and super buff and very tall and big and strong. And he had his best friend who was also kind of a superhero guy, and his name was Enkidu. Super, they were like the big tough dudes, but they wanted to stop bad things. So they did some heroic stuff and everything, but they also kind of went against the gods a bit. And they were messing with some of the things the gods had done. And the gods in this system were very much like Greek gods in that they were selfish and heedless, and they didn't really care about human beings a whole lot. And so Gilgamesh and Enkidu were doing, causing trouble for the gods anyway. And then the goddess Ishtar, you've probably heard the name Ishtar, but she is the goddess of the heavens in the system. Well, she decides Gilgamesh is super good looking. And so she says, hey, why don't you marry me? And he says, nope. And in fact, he says, nope. And you've had all these other mortal men as husbands already. And what happened to all of them? They all died. And most of it was because of you. And so, no, I'm not taking that risk. I mean, he refuses her. Well, she gets angry. And what does she do? She kills his best friend, Enkidu. And for the rest of the epic, he is trying to find a way to get immortality. And he never finds it, but he gets a lot of perspective. It's almost like, you have to be aware as mortals, we are not going to live forever. And so we have to get used to the fact that this life will end. And that's what he eventually does. So it's not the most spine-tingling, amazing. But for its time, it's astonishing that there was that much plot put together, and especially that they had memorized all of this and sung it. But it was certainly it's a common idea in polytheistic faiths where the gods don't really care a whole lot about us, so we might as well live life to the fullest and be as happy as we can, and hopefully not tick any of them off, so that we can live as long as possible, but understand that we will die. And the gods can be selfish and mean or whatever they want to be, but they will outlive us. They have immortality even if we do not. And it's sad. It is. But it's, the Greeks are going to talk about the same thing, essentially. The other thing that was written at this time was in Babylon, also part of the Mesopotamian region, and it was Hammurabi's code. This code is actually a legal code. So, and you can see this stele, it's a tablet, it's a big, like, stone with writing on it. That's what a stele is. And on the stone, you can't really see it because it's black, but 282 different codified laws are written, well, stamped or carved into this stone in Sanskrit. And it was a way of essentially, this was written in other places as well. This is just the oldest copy that we have. And it was essentially to make it so that no matter where you were tried, in what legal place you were tried, the law was the same, and your trial would be the same, and your punishment would be the same. But what it also shows us today is that laws were not equal. So a person who was a slave, who was convicted of something, would get a far harsher sentence than someone who was of the upper class and who committed that same crime. So if you were an upper class man, especially, you would get away with much more with far less punishment than if you were lower class or slave class or a woman. There is, although, what's one thing that's interesting about this, though, is that there was a presumption of innocence. You had to be convicted. They had to have enough evidence to convict you of the crime, and until then, you were considered innocent. So it's really interesting, and the fact that they were trying to make it so that this law was going to be practiced throughout, so that no court would kind of go rogue or something. But the truth is we today, the Romans will build on this, and they'll have a very strict codified law that they will spread throughout their Roman Empire. But we do the same thing today. We have codified laws that affect federal legal cases and also affect state legal cases. We go by precedents. What did previous courts that tried on the basis of something or other, what did they find? And the Supreme Court is kind of overseeing all of that, at least in our country. Most countries follow a similar set of laws where they create these codified laws, and this is how things are supposed to run, and this is what punishments are usually attributed to this, and then they try to be as consistent as possible. Is it consistent? We're imperfect. So is any system perfect? No. And this was not. But even in its codification, it was not. So then we get to the Egyptians. And they're probably the most advanced of any of the populations that we cover in chapter 1. Although they really do draw a lot, they have a lot of similarities with the Sumerians and with other Mesopotamian cultures too. But they had their own system of writing. And at first, honestly, it wasn't until the beginning of the 20th century that anybody even figured out what all the different hieroglyphics meant. They finally have discovered that each symbol is essentially a creature or something, and then the beginning sound of that in Egyptian is the phonetic word or the phonetic sound that is supposed to be related. And so that's kind of how they've translated it. But most of our examples of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics are in burials, because that's what has survived. They were, carved out in stone and placed underneath the ground in a burial usually for a very esteemed individual. It could be a priest, certainly a pharaoh or a pharaoh's queen, although queens could be pharaohs as well. Thank you, Queen Cleopatra. But this is where the vast majority of them, people sometimes look at Egypt and think, oh, wow, these people were enamored with death. Well, they really weren't. It's just that for them, of course, what they were writing about depended on what they were writing for. And if all your writings are found in burial plots, they're not going to be talking about, flowers and government and things like, they're going to be talking about death. And so we don't think that Egypt was really, enamored with death, or they thought about it all the time, but they did look at it far more ritualistically than many other cultures did at the time. And they certainly tried as much as possible to create a system whereby at least the pharaohs and those of, who deserved it, who were super upper class, would go on to an eternity with the gods. And one way that they did this is a very unique element. It's very strange compared to most other polytheistic systems, those systems with many gods, is that the king, the pharaoh, the leader of the Egyptian domain, was considered to be a god. He was given God incarnate status. So he was the God in the flesh. And when he died, he would go on to live with the big immortal gods. And then the next person who was Pharaoh would become the God incarnate. It also gave the Pharaoh implacable power. You can't deny that what the Pharaoh orders, because he is a god. So the Pharaoh could pretty much do whatever he wanted. And he did, he killed people if he felt like it, if he changed his mind about something, well, that changed everybody's mind, or at least it better. And so the Pharaoh had a tremendous amount of power. He was named a lot of different names: Ra, Re, Aten. We will get to the god Akhenaten, and he's essentially changed his name to that because it fits in the Aten part. But he's actually going to mess around with the god system a bit. But one thing that, to help them along, to help them go become immortal with all the other gods, pharaohs and priests and those of the very upper class had to, essentially, when they died, their body was treated with one of the most elaborate mummification systems we have ever known in any culture. Normally we do things with chemicals, if you're going to have an open casket or something. But what they did, given their technology differences, is astonishing. And so their mummification process actually took about 10 weeks to complete. They would or slurp, I guess, the brain out of a person's nose, and then they would take out all of their inner organs, wrap them up separately, and then tuck them back in, which is really interesting. But we don't do anything like that today. But all of this was designed around the idea of preserving everything. The understanding too with Egyptian burial, is that if you buried stuff with the person in the burial, that then they would be able to use that stuff when they go off into the immortal world. So there's one burial we know of that even had a humongous boat in it, buried in there with the pharaoh, and it's so he could have a boat in the immortal life. And Egyptians are not alone in this. A lot of people, a lot of different cultures, put things, memorabilia or other things, in with the casket. I mean, we even do that. But for instance, in traditional Chinese ritual, people would actually make paper versions of things: horses, food, carriages, or other things, tools that they can use, and make them out of paper and then burn them at the burial, or burn them by their graves. And then the people who have died get to ride around in the carriages or have the horses or things like that. So there was still, that's still actually a tradition today. And that in some ways, what we do here can actually help somebody who's moved on into the afterlife. As far as the art is concerned in ancient Egypt, the pharaoh is very often depicted either taller than everybody else, or in some ways connected to the sun, and that's part of his god status. But even in when we get to Akhenaten, we're going to see you'll see in the chapter, if you haven't read it already, you need to. But in the chapter, you'll see some pictures of Akhenaten and his wife, Isis. I mean, not Isis, his wife, Nefertiti. And they're both, sometimes they're holding their children, but there's always the sun. And very often they're either pointing to the sun or the sun is shining on them or something like that. And that's a depiction, again, of there being some godlike something. Now, Egyptian women, if you were going to live in the ancient period, you either wanted to be Polynesian or Native American if you were a woman, because many of those systems were matriarchal, where the female figure was the head of the tribe, or you wanted to be Egyptian, because women in Egypt, men would if they were inheriting, from their parents, the men would inherit the money. The women held all the land. And so women had tremendous power compared to most other cultures. The Greeks, for instance, had almost that women were essentially slaves. They had no use. They weren't worth listening to. If they were just almost non-entities. For Egyptians, though, that is not the case. Women could rule. Women could divorce their husbands. Women did inherit the land. Men did not. So this was one of those cases where you wanted both male and female children. Unfortunately, in the case of pharaohs and a lot of royal families, that meant that a brother and a sister often got married to keep the land and the wealth all in the family. And today, by our standards, that's disgusting. But that was not uncommon at all in the Egyptian culture. Of course, they didn't know anything about, germs and chromosomes and inbreeding or anything. Nah, they didn't know any of that stuff. It was very common for women to have, they were very much still part of a family, so they were the caregivers primarily, but they still had power outside of the family situation. They could sue, they could own property, which is something that most other cultures women could not do. Even in England, women couldn't own, they couldn't get the vote until they got the legal right to own property. And that was right around the turn of the 20th century. So for Americans, it was the same. Women could not own property and they could not vote for the longest time. So it's the fact that at this way long time ago, time period, the Egyptian women could and did own all the property is fascinating and good. I mean, certainly, women just had power, and that was not normal. Most other cultures at this time, even ancient China, men had a lot of prospects, and in China, women did not. They were very limited. So gender did make a big difference in most of the ancient cultures. Now, our chapter contends that the Egyptians were obsessed with the afterlife. I've already kind of explained to you why that's probably not true. But I do want you to just kind of keep that in mind as we go, that just because most of their writings and their drawings were all set inside tombs doesn't mean that all they thought about was death. It just means that's what survived. But they had a lot of art. Most of it was very formal, kind of like this Egyptian guy here being crowned by two goddesses. It was the figures were very thin. You've probably heard the old song, "Walk like an Egyptian," and they're all kind of like sticking their hands out stiffly. Well, that's because much of the art, whether it was full figures or it was in relief, was of a profile, very stiff figure, very slender, with not a lot of realism. It was definitely a very formal sort of element. But they also had a lot of structures that still survive. So we do have a lot of, quite a few sculptures and relief sculptures. So, the carvings in walls that have survived. But we also have architecture. The pyramids, obviously, they're probably number one. They were not built by slaves. They were built by craftsmen. We know that now. So what was it? 10 Commandments, the movie, is a great movie. I love that movie with Charlton Heston in it. But the slaves did not build the pyramids. They just didn't. They were built by craftsmen. They took about 20 years to build. And they are still in really good shape. You can't really walk close to them anymore, but they've survived amazingly well considering. We also have the Sphinx at Giza, and much of the nose of the head on the lion is, broken off, and it's been weathered quite a bit, but it's still very recognizable even today. There are also a lot of temples, and there are quite a few, what's the word, burials that are still intact. We also, have quite a few temples, and temples are not like what we're probably used to as churches, or even there are religions today that have temples, but most temples or churches today are open to the public. So you go in, you sit in a service, or something like that. And that's the way it's been for a couple thousand years at least. For Egyptians, though, temples were only for priests. And if you were to go to a temple, you rarely did anything but stand at the door. And then you would ask the priest questions, you give them offerings, you do things like that. And then they would go inside, do all sorts of secret whatever, and then come back out and give you answers. But the inside of temples, even the ones that have survived, are very bare. And we assume most of it and they're very small because they weren't meant to have hundreds of people coming in and attending a service. That simply did not happen. The priests ran the temples, and they were pretty much the only ones who went inside as well. And they would, from those temples, they would come out and they'd speak for the gods, and they'd talk about omens and predict the future, and try to guide the population based on what signs they have seen as priests. So it's a little bit different. There's a Greek equivalent that we'll get to in the next chapter, with the oracle at Delphi, and where they kind of predict the future. And a lot of Greek mythology deals with this idea of, having someone's fate foretold to them. But we don't have a lot of evidence, actually, because of the lack of writing of this stuff. For the Egyptians, we don't know exactly what they predicted or we know that they used a number of different ways of foretelling, including, tea leaves and looking at the innards of birds, and, it was a lot of different stuff. But we don't know exactly what they were looking for. So, or what types of questions they were dealing with. All we know is they were pretty much the only ones inside the temples. Now you can see this is actually a burial temple, but it's at the bottom of a pyramid. Can you see the pyramid going up? Hopefully you can. And in this pyramid, essentially what happens is people would create a tunnel first, and this is through post and lintel structure. So if you look at the photograph to the right, you're going to see two stones that are very kind of rectangular, sticking up on either side of the dark doorway, right? Those are the posts. And then there's one big slab of a stone above them, resting on top of them, and that's the lintel. This is a very traditional and the most ancient style for doorways. And we still use it today. If you are sitting in your house right now and you have wood framing around your house, and you look at your doorway, you're going to see that the door is in post and lintel style. It actually has two long boards going down, and then it has one across. And if you go into the wall, you're going to see exactly the same thing. They have posts that hold up the two sides of the door, and underneath the plywood or sheetrock or whatever you're using, underneath that is a lintel board, an actual board to hold up whatever is above the doorway. Now they would build a whole tunnel of these though, so they'd have rock going back and making this huge kind of narrow hallway. Then people would take the dead person and carry it through that hole, that big doorway, all the way back to where it's kind of enlarged a bit inside. Then they would put the body where it needs to be, put all its artifacts around it and things like that, and then come back out and seal up the door. And then they would cover the entire thing with dirt. And so we have, and they call them burial mounds today. Dolmen means a mound, but very often these are covered with dirt, sediment. And often they're covered with grass, and they're harder to see, unless you have a clear view of them. We have mounds even today that were built by Native American tribes, probably, several thousand years ago, here in the state of Georgia. There's a place called the Kolomoki Mound State Park, and it's past Quitman. No, not Quitman. It's past Colquitt, and it's very near the border with Alabama. And it's a state park, Kolomoki Mound State Park, and you can actually see inside a dolmen what it actually looked like inside that mound. And there was in that case, there was a king buried there. He actually had, they think, slaves buried alive with him, that which is horrifying. And yet that also, we know this happened with the Egyptians as well. Yes, live slaves, or unfortunately, sometimes a spouse was buried with the person who had died, and they would be buried alive, which is horrible because then they'd starve to death and that's how they die, or run out of oxygen. It's just awful. But this was very typical. But they even happened here. So this was a very common structure for burial, especially for very, well-to-do individuals. The only problem is that over time, with all the weight of sediment and rocks and everything else up above this post and lintel doorway, it was extremely common for it to cave in. The lintel up on the top would crack, and then everything would kind of fall in. So today, if you have these that have existed and survived, they are either fortified, so they have things up inside kind of holding them all up, or they are off limits. You are not allowed to go inside because they could break at any point. Now, Tutankhamun's, just as a relative thing, essentially what they figured out after making all these big burial mounds is that if you make it too obvious where somebody's buried, then that burial gets looted. And so Tutankhamun, King Tut, his stuff was survived without being looted for hundreds, well, thousands of years, because it was hidden. So he was in what it would now call the Valley of the Pharaohs, but it's essentially a place where they buried a lot of people, but they hid the burials so that no one would know where to dig. And so those things survived. As far as, remember, I talked to you about the relief sculpture, and this is really a relief sculpture. Down at the bottom, the thing that looks sort of brickish, but you can see a person on a chariot with a horse. That's a relief sculpture, very formal. You're going to see it less formalized when we get to the Greeks. But in Egyptian sculpture and Egyptian art, much of what was there was very stiff figures with very stiff arms, very rigid structure, expressionless faces. And often the man and the woman look very similar. So the very far right, the kind of bluish purple stone sculpture that you see with a man and his wife, it's actually a burial sculpture for them. But the husband and wife, their faces look almost exactly the same. What's different is he's wearing an attachment to his chin for his, to symbolize his beard, and then her headdress is more hair than, like formal cloth or something. And she's also wearing different clothing, if she's wearing clothing at all. Women did not. If Egyptian women, if they did wear clothing, it was often very see-through. And it often only covered, just like with the men, it at times it only covered the bottom half of them, and that was just pretty normal. In pretty much men wore, I mean, again, you were living in a very hot climate, but men really only covered the bottom part of themselves. And then upper body, they would wear very ornate necklaces if they were super wealthy or were pharaoh, or they'd wear headdresses. And they often shaved their hair off, and they would wear the headdress instead. And it had to have been hot, so I don't know why they did that, but they did. Most of them, though, you'll see are like this. They could be kneeling, they could be sitting formally, or even standing, but they're very formal figures. They are not, they're not highly recognizable as far as, you can see that they're human, but you wouldn't be able to pick out that person in a lineup because they're that normal and that kind of ordinary looking. The last thing we'll talk about a little is the religious belief. And I'm not going to go into a lot of this. if you are interested in their afterlife ideas, though, probably the best thing to do is go to the Book of the Dead. The Book of the Dead covers essentially a lot of negative confessions that a soul will have to say when he gets to the afterlife and meets the gods and it sits in judgment. He will have to say things like, I didn't kill people, I didn't steal from people, I didn't take God's name in vain, which is really fascinating because many of the recitation for the Book of the Dead actually resembles the Ten Commandments. So a lot of it is overlaps, which is fascinating. Now, if he says all of this and he's lying, the gods will know. And in fact, there's even a god that will come and take him and eat out his soul and destroy him. And that will be the end of him. So it's really important what you do during your lifetime, because when you get to the afterlife, it's not necessarily a good thing. And there were certainly things within the burials that were trying to, certain pathways to make sure that you would go in the right direction to go find your spiritual afterlife and be reunited with your spirit after death. So it was, essentially the afterlife wasn't a lot different. It's not like people run around, it's not like, halos and clouds and people playing harps or something. It was often very much like regular life, but you didn't starve to death. You weren't poor. There was no suffering. And that was the big difference. With Greeks, it's going to be quite different. So it may be something to think about too. And then we get to monotheism. It's the only time that the Egyptians were monotheistic was during the reign of Pharaoh Akhenaten. He decided that there was only one God and it was him. So remember, pharaohs were gods incarnate, gods in the flesh. So he decided he was the only God. The other gods did not exist. And he ordered that the entire kingdom only worship him, with the caveat that his wife Nefertiti was kind of like Isis. She's sort of like God. And you can see on this illustration down at the bottom, this is him in the middle, Akhenaten, and the sun is shining down on him, but it's also shining behind him to another figure, and that is Nefertiti. And there's another illustration in your chapter of them both seated, and the sun is radiating on both of them. Now, once he died, it was funny because the Egyptians went along with it, because remember, he's God incarnate. What he says goes. And yet at some point, he has to die. He can't live forever because he's not really God. He's just God incarnate, and that doesn't make him immortal. So the assumption was he went off to the gods. Who knows how they treated him since he denied their existence. And then the very next pharaoh declared that now we were polytheistic again. And the other gods did exist and we would worship them all. And that was King Tut. He came after, that was Akhenaten's nephew. He only reigned to be 18, so he reigned only a few years. But in those few years, he made all of the temple names, everything went back to polytheism. So they went back to worshiping all of the gods that they had worshipped before, Osiris and Isis and all that. So it's funny how we're monotheistic, but just for a little bit. And that is all of chapter 1. If you do have questions, especially as you're going through the chapter, please put them in your journals. So make sure you read the chapter, view this recording, and then as you're going through these things, write down your questions and put them in your journal, because I will probably address some of those at the beginning, either in a special live classroom or as a special recording, but I will do everything I can to answer you, whatever your questions happen to be. And this is the beginning. Next time we will talk about the Greeks. And they began just a little bit later than the Egyptian civilization began, but they will really develop writing in a way that is their civilization in general in ways that the Egyptians did not. So hopefully we'll get to all of that.